Thank you. That's my stage manager at work, so I'm thankful for her help. So it's been an exciting day, especially an exciting afternoon. Welcome to this climactic session of the 2020 Rise Above Research Conference. We've had an impressive number of student presentations this afternoon covering the breadth of Milligan's curriculum, involving almost 50 students and about 15 faculty mentors. And I highly congratulate both the students and the faculty mentors on the quality of their work and just the amazing variety of topics that were covered today. It's rather fascinating and amazing. And now we come to the crowning jewel of this year's conference, the annual faculty lecture. Our presenters will share their work, and then when they've had their say, we'll take questions from you. Again, you can direct your questions to me in the chat feature on Zoom, and then when they have finished, I will share those questions as we have time. Our Rise Above Conference faculty lecture for 2020 is entitled Much Casual Death, Lessons from a Course on Genocide in the Age of COVID-19, presented to us tonight by Drs. Joy Drinnon and Ted Thomas. Joy Drinnon, professor of psychology and director of undergraduate research at Milligan, is an East Tennessean who's taught at Milligan since 1999. She's worked with a number of agencies in Appalachia dealing with homelessness and other particular needs of people living in Appalachian communities. Dr. Ted Thomas, professor of humanities, history, German, and pretty much whatever else we can find for him to do, has lived from Maine to Malibu and places in between, and has also taught at Milligan since 1991. So there's some sort of synergistic energy for these two colleagues who have both been at Milligan for these past 20 or 21 years. Dr. Thomas's area of specialization is modern European history, with a particular focus on Germany and the Holocaust, and has been doing extended research in the past decade on Holocaust rescuer Hermann Maas. Drs. Drinnon and Thomas recently co-taught a course on the genocide and trauma, and they're going to actually correct me at some point about what that course actually was, but that's my recollection. And so for tonight's Rise Above Research Conference faculty lecture, please welcome Drs. Joy Drinnon and Ted Thomas.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now so that we can get started. Maybe.
It's working for me.
Is it working for you?
Yep.
Oh, let me get back here then. Maybe. Doesn't seem to be showing appropriately for me. So do you see just the main slide or all the ones on the left side too?
All the ones.
Yep.
Okay. Can't seem to get it to.
You have to go to slideshow.
Yeah. I've done that. I don't know.
What?
Oh, well, there we go. We'll try there. Can you see that now? No?
Go back to slideshow. I saw something.
Oh, is it not showing what I'm seeing here?
Maybe not. We still see the stuff on the left.
Right.
Which is not a tragedy if anybody sees it.
Joy, I would just go out and try it again.
Oh, there we go. All right.
Yep.
Is that better?
That's perfect.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So, title of our lecture tonight is Genocide in the Age of COVID-19. So, let's just start with the course and why we taught it, and Ted and I will go back and forth during this lecture tonight. So I'm going to start with why this particular course. So I teach social psychology at Milligan, and pretty regularly I'll be teaching concepts that remind me of things that have to do with genocides, particularly the Holocaust and Rwanda, because I can remember when the genocide in Rwanda happened in 1994, so that one stands out to me, and I read a book about it and it really stuck with me. So when I would teach that course and have those concepts come up, I always wanted to dig a little bit deeper, but there was never time in my social psych course to really do that. Also, it's kind of a depressing topic, kind of a heavy topic. But I knew at some point I wanted to dig a little deeper, but I knew that I didn't have the expertise to really do that, or at least to do the history of the genocides justice. So I knew I needed a collaborator, a colleague who had the expertise to do that. And so when I heard that Ted was thinking about retiring, I wanted to jump on the opportunity to see if he would come alongside me and teach this course with me so that we could kind of bounce back and forth between the history of the genocides and the psychology of them. I was also inspired by a colleague, Bert Allen, who's a psychology professor, retired, who taught a course with Tim Dillon, a history professor for years, on Vietnam, and I thought that was really cool. And so I wanted to teach an interdisciplinary course too before my time was up here. So I invited Ted. He was gracious enough to join me and put in a whole lot of work this past year, because we've been planning this for about a year now. And 2019 seemed like a good time too, because I had been seeing and noticing some things happening around the world, a rise in nationalism, authoritarianism, some genocidal activities in China and Myanmar related to Muslims. And I thought it was an important time for students to maybe have an opportunity to understand why genocides happen and how to prevent them ideally. So that's why the course. Ted's going to talk about the title and why we chose this really strange title.
Well, you've got to have a title. You have to have a catchy title to sell the hours to get people to take your course. History and Psychology of Genocide sounded a little too clinical. So we went with a poem that we hoped our students who've been through sophomore humanities might recognize. This is Anthony Hecht's More Light, More Light. The title, More Light, comes from Goethe's words as he lay dying, the last things he said. We don't know if he was asking for more light or whether he was seeing more light. But the poem tells the story, tells two stories. The second story is the story of three men, three men in a concentration camp, two of whom are Jews, and the only reason they are alive, as this section here comes to play, is because they were, after the three men had dug a hole, a German soldier ordered the two Jews to get in the hole where the Polish man was supposed to bury them alive. But he refused to do that, risked his life refusing to do it. So he was forced to get in the hole, and the two Jews who are now out of the hole were supposed to bury him alive. And then comes this phrase in the last stanza that you see, much casual death had drained away their souls. And they were prepared to bury him alive after he had refused to do that to them. The story goes on, you can read the poem. But much casual death, we saw how normal human beings did atrocious things, had lost all sense of a co-humanity with victims whom they persecuted during these various genocides. That's why we chose that title.
Okay. So we focused this lecture on the events that are going on today because we had planned this lecture way back in the fall, but at the time we didn't think there was going to be a pandemic. We didn't anticipate a pandemic, as many of you did not. And so we were just going to be giving a lecture over a bunch of different lessons, or maybe what it was like to team teach a course. But as we started to think about this lecture, I think both of us were noticing that some of the lessons that we had learned in the fall and taught the students in the fall were kind of popping up and seemed relevant in light of the present day crisis, because one of the primary things that precedes a genocide is a crisis or a destabilizing kind of event, like a war or a pandemic. And so many concepts are relevant. And so tonight we're going to try to cover just a handful, about 6 lessons that we think are relevant. And these are by no means the only things that are relevant or applicable, but we think these are ones that we can kind of manageably cover in a 45-minute kind of lecture. So without further ado, we're going to get started, and I'm going to start with the first couple of lessons and then turn it over to Ted for some more. So the first lesson is that crisis breeds conflict between groups. Ted and I had a difficult decision from the beginning with this course to decide which genocides we were going to cover and focus on to keep the course pretty manageable. And as you can see, this is still a lot of genocides to cover, and it's not an exhaustive list. There are many more genocides than these, but we thought we could kind of fit these in. And so we went back and forth. Ted would cover a genocide, and then I would cover some social psychology concepts that were relevant, and we moved through the course that way. The term genocide means to kill a race or a nation. And in every example, there was an identifiable group that was trying to annihilate another group. And the reasons for the genocides are quite varied, but at the core, there was always some identifiable group difference between the groups and a conflict that compelled them to want to attack one another. In many cases, the conflict precedes the genocide by many years, so there's conflict for a while that builds up. And the groups differ on a number of different characteristics. They differ by race, religion, but things like education, class, culture, values, those kinds of things inevitably lead to some conflict. And a destabilizing event or a crisis exacerbates those differences and magnifies any existing sources of conflict. The most common reason for conflict between groups is a competition over basic needs. So one of the first lessons we talked about was Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And COVID-19, the coronavirus, is a clear and present danger to our health and to our economy. It threatens the basic human needs of all humanity. And so this is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs here. And you can see that at the bottom, the most important needs are safety and security and survival. And above that is love and attachment, and then feeling good about yourself. And finally, the ability to self-actualize or to really rise above and help your fellow mankind. But you have to meet all the other needs below that. You know, we've all seen the jokes about toilet paper and hand sanitizer, and I think I even saw a meme with this in one of the courses, one of the groups that I follow. But why toilet paper? You know, it gives a sense of security when you don't have control over anything else. You can at least have toilet paper, right? So gives us some peace of mind to think that that we have security there. But in all seriousness, there have been shortages of things, and people have resorted to hoarding and aggression as we're competing for these kinds of things that will help ensure our safety. And on April 13th, I heard the first reports of possible meat shortages in the United States. And last night on the news, they were talking about famine around the world potentially. And so if food becomes scarce, fear and panic will likely take over, and a lot of the normal restraints we have against being helpful and kind to other people may kind of fall aside because we're trying to meet those basic needs. So conflict will increase invariably. There are two social psychological theories that I want to touch on that relate to conflict. And the first is pretty self-explanatory, and that's realistic group conflict, which basically just says that when groups are in conflict over scarce resources, they're going to, you know, compete and be more aggressive. And there are examples besides toilet paper that are relevant here. Personal protective equipment, medical supplies, these essential life-saving equipment. States are having to compete one-on-one in a market for these items. Across the world, countries are competing for them. So that's a real source of conflict as one example. The other theory is terror management theory. And it basically theorizes that as we face the prospect of mortality, the fact that we may die, we're going to seek in-group alliances and assurances that our values are going to live on after we pass away. So as a result of threats to death like COVID-19, we grow increasingly fearful. And we manage that terror by closing ranks. We get together with our families and our communities and our tribes of like-minded people. Because after all, if they love us and they accept us, then our values are going to live on through them, even if we don't survive. But this theory has a darker prediction about human nature too that's important. This theory predicts that when we experience fears of mortality, we're also more likely to be prejudiced. Because after all, one way of feeling better about ourselves is making other people look worse than us. So it predicts that prejudice is one of the consequences, which brings me to the second lesson that I want to cover tonight, which is relevant, is that crisis breeds prejudice. Prejudice always precedes genocide. After all, genocide has to be justified. So it starts with identifying a group to scapegoat. You find a vulnerable population or a group that's noticeably different in some way, and then you label them the problem. As prejudice first ramps up, ordinary citizens and members of the non-persecuted class, they have a chance to object, or they could tolerate and condone the rising prejudice. If it's condoned by the population, then it becomes easier for the national leaders and the government to perpetuate and justify further acts towards genocide. And this progression may start with just harassment, name calling, negative propaganda, the kind that you see here on the screen. But it can quickly shift to blatant discriminatory policies and laws like the Nuremberg laws, forced relocation, labor, re-education camps, starvation, and eventually mass extermination. The Holocaust is, of course, probably one of the most familiar examples of this progression from prejudice to genocide, but it's not the only one. Every genocide that we looked at had this progression because a crisis like a pandemic is the kind of thing that may exacerbate that prejudice. And prejudice needs a foe, fear needs a foe. So scapegoating displaced aggression. With COVID-19, we have an obvious explanation for fears that we have, but we don't have anywhere to direct that frustration or that anger. A virus doesn't respond to name calling or any kind of human aggression. But our anger about the economic, social, health consequences of this virus must be directed somewhere. This displaced aggression is when aggression is redirected at an easier target or an available target. And this is especially likely if we can make some kind of connection between our anger and frustration and the target group. So at a microcosm level, if you look at families, there's going to be an increase in domestic violence because spouses may take their frustrations out on one another or their children, especially if there's a history of violence there or an inability to manage emotions effectively. But it's also going to manifest at a community and a national level as well, as frustrations are directed at those that we perceive as spreading or causing the virus. So you've probably heard about some of the rise in discrimination towards Asian Americans recently. There was a hate crime reporting site that received over 1,000 reports in its first 2 weeks. Interestingly, women were more likely to be targeted than men at about twice the rate, but that kind of fits in with the displaced aggression idea that we're going to target people who are easier, more vulnerable. Ironically, I just saw a report recently that Africans in China were facing discrimination as reports came out that they were being infected. And so discrimination isn't just for one group or one country. This is something that's part of human nature. Prejudice. So hate groups. There's a general rise right now among hate groups that are using the crisis to scapegoat their usual minority targets. White nationalists and other hate groups are stuck at home too, and they're on social media more like the rest of us. and they have time to concoct conspiracy theories. For example, one conspiracy to promote anti-Semitism is that the prominent Democratic donor George Soros was somehow responsible for the virus being released. This is not logical. There's no credible evidence for this, but if you're looking for a scapegoat, you can always find one, especially during a crisis. And a final point I'll make here in this lesson is that discrepancies about the impact of this virus are coming to our attention. And it's hard to admit that the world is not a just or a fair place. The virus and the economic crisis have revealed that there are groups of people who are more adversely affected than others. So there are higher infection and death rates among minorities and low-income populations, both in our nation and around the world. The reasons are complex, of course, but public health experts agree that these groups were more vulnerable in part because of health and income disparities that preceded the virus. And when we hear about income inequality and inequality in access to healthcare, housing, high quality foods, we're tempted to assume that those people, if you will, somehow deserve their fate, that they're somehow responsible for their own increased vulnerability. So this just world thinking, as it's called, perpetuates prejudice because it alleviates some of our discomfort that we feel about inequality. After all, if people are partly to blame, then we don't need to fix systems that may have led to a higher death rate to begin with. Okay, I'm done with my first two lessons on this. I'm going to turn it over to Ted.
About crisis breeding authoritarianism and nationalism. So when a crisis comes along, people want someone to take charge and fix what's broken. And that raises the danger of falling into the hands of a leader with an overweening ego, an authoritarian who is not fond of ideas of democracy or shared power. And we have examples like that all over the place. Authoritarian leaders. We started off looking at one of the most difficult things to look at, biblical genocide. But you can see Moses as an authoritarian leader. He did not suffer resistance to his orders, and Joshua afterwards, and other authoritarian leaders that have risen in the face of crises. A fellow by the name of Dutty Boukman in Haiti, and after him, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Pol Pot, Slobodan Milosevic. Wherever we see genocide, we frequently see a charismatic leader who wants to take control of everything. They all demand absolute obedience. They found weaker nations, weaker people groups to prey on. Their power was demonstrated in violent destruction. They are frequently driven by a deterministic philosophy, something metaphysical. And it's not just individuals. Whole groups of people can behave like that. And when that happens, we call that nationalism. When nationalism drives genocide, it demonstrates the same things that these individuals have demonstrated. Think, for example, of the conquistadores that came from Spain into Mexico and Peru, wiped out the Aztecs and the Incas. Think about the Europeans who came in and drove the Native Americans further and further west. Think about the metaphysics there, the philosophies of manifest destiny, American exceptionalism, or Rudyard Kipling's white man's burden. There's always some type of philosophical justification for doing what goes on. So we looked at these biblical genocides. The Israelites, children of Israel, were threatened with annihilation any numbers of times, but then they turned around and they became the perpetrators of genocide too, in the conquest of Canaan, and going in and obliterating every man, woman, child, and animal in a village. We're too familiar with genocide in our own country. Why are there no Cherokees anymore in northeast Tennessee? Well, European settlers drove them out. the Haitian genocide of 1804. We looked at that as a time when Toussaint Louverture and even more violent Jean-Jacques Dessalines rose up, taking advantage of a crisis to assert themselves. The Armenian genocide, right during World War I, and then the Holodomor of the Ukraine, perpetrated by Stalin, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, 1932 and 33. Let's go on and talk about some of these in detail. The crisis provides a way of covering up evil. I think we're out of sync with our slides and my commentary here.
Oh, where should we be, Ted?
Back up a little bit.
Also, Mary, I think there's some people waiting to get in, possibly. Where should I go, Ted?
Back up to the slide where we had Toussaint Louverture's picture.
Okay.
There we go. He was not really as bad authoritarian as Jean-Jacques Dessalines, but the crisis in Haiti came about because there were far more African slaves than there were French colonists there. And all those African slaves, hundreds of thousands of them, started hearing things that were coming from France. In France, they were having a revolution and talking about civil rights and the humanity of all people. And some of those people in Haiti heard that and they thought those were good ideas. Well, so one thing led to another. Some of these authoritarian leaders rose up, and in the course of a year, 5,000 French colonists lost their lives as the African slaves rose up. That is the only example in history of a successful slave revolution. That particular slave revolt ends up in forming the second oldest republic in the Western Hemisphere. The United States is older. Haiti got off to a bloody, bloody start that way. In Armenia, the crisis arose because the Turks had lost the war, the first Balkan War, 1912, 1913. And when the Turks lost that war, the Muslims, the Turks who were living in Bulgaria and Greece and Serbia, they fled the Balkan Peninsula. They wanted to come back home to Anatolia. So they started flowing into Turkey. And the Turkish government didn't know what to do with all these people. It didn't have the infrastructure to care for them. So it settled them off in the east, in the area where the Armenians were living. The Armenians are in Turkey, but the Armenians are a Christian minority. The Armenians have always wanted their independence. They have kind of courted the favor of the Russians, who share a border with Turkey. So the Turkish government was already suspicious of the Armenians because of their nationality, because of their politics, and because of their religion. Now they move into that territory, all these displaced people from the war zone, they come in. The refugees resent the Armenians because the Armenians are financially better off. They're established, they have nicer houses. So this tension builds and builds and builds. And finally, under the cover of war, the Turkish government lashes out against the Armenians and commits genocide. That strange looking word in the Cyrillic alphabet, Holodomor, that is the Ukrainian word for the genocide perpetrated by the crisis that Stalin faced. Stalin needed a lot of money. He needed to industrialize Russia. He needed to build steel plants. He needed to build locomotives, and he needed to lay track, and he needed to build hydroelectric dams. Where was he going to get the money for that? Well, the Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Lots of grain down there. So Stalin goes down. Oh, he's also suspicious of the Ukrainians because Ukraine came into the Soviet Union with not quite a unanimous voice. It came in because a small but active communist party dragged it in. So there's lots of counter-revolutionary sentiment in Ukraine. That unsettles Stalin. So Stalin goes in to take care of 2 or 3 problems at once, confiscates almost all the grain from the Ukrainian farmers, sells it on the international market, brings in all the cash he needs to build his industry. The Ukrainians are left without enough grain to plant next year's crop. They don't have enough grain to feed their animals. So they starve to death. Those that aren't killed outright, they starve to death. It's a man-made famine, but it was aimed at an ethnic group, at a nationality, at the Ukrainians. These are awful stories to tell, and I was grateful for Joy's ability to come back and talk about rescuers and good things that happened in the light of these events. Let's go to the next slide and talk briefly what we've already touched on about crisis being an opportunity to cover the evil that you've wanted to do anyway. So in Germany, for example, in the Third Reich, the evil was already present in the Nazi government in Germany, but it was somewhat hidden, and it only broke into open mass action when World War II broke out. So Hitler created his own war to cover his crime against the Jews. Under the fog of war, that means endless convoys of military vehicles, news of battles beyond the borders, reports of dead and wounded, all that stuff is coming in every day. While that's coming in, Hitler's minions started rounding up the sick children and the incurably ill elderly, the congenitally handicapped, the epileptic, the blind, the halt, the lame, started rounding them up to get rid of them because they were costing money and they were never going to work. They were never going to be productive. They were life unworthy of life. So this was a genocide against Germans, against German citizens who would not be productive in any way. And then, of course, the Holocaust begins with the wholesale slaughter of Jews during the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. The big news of the war crowded out the reports about burning Jews inside their own synagogues, crowded out the reports of machine gunning of masses of Jews on the edge of freshly bulldozed pits. The Nazis weren't eager for that news to get out. They didn't publicize it. When it did get out, it was still overshadowed by the personal losses of German citizens back home who were concerned about their husbands and fathers and sons and brothers who were risking their lives in the war. The crisis in Cambodia is another example. Cambodian crisis was brought about because the Americans started bombing Cambodia in the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese were using trails over in Cambodia to bring supplies down south. America started bombing Cambodia. The Communist Party in Cambodia had no difficulty recruiting people against the Americans, and they particularly were effective in radicalizing children. So this provocative photograph of a fairly young boy with a powerful gun in his hand. If you've seen the movie Killing Fields, you see a portrayal there of how the country was taken over by young people who understood so little. Pol Pot is our authoritarian leader who's had plans all along, and now this war gives him an opportunity of committing what is unique. This is auto-genocide, Cambodians killing Cambodians. It's class war. Pol Pot's idea, and the idea of the Communist Party, was to return Cambodia to a pristine, Edenic, agricultural society in which there was no money, no private property. There's the Marxist part of it. But there were too many people in Cambodia to do that. There were about 7 million people, and they'd figured out that the optimum population is 2 million. So they're going to get rid of people who have soft, uncalloused hands. They're going to get rid of people who are intellectuals. You can tell they are because they can read and they wear glasses and maybe they speak French. So this class of people was wiped out because they wouldn't make good farmers. Cambodia was overpopulated, and the government's slogan to its own people was, "To keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss." All of that taking place in the fog of war and the crisis offering an opportunity for mass murder. It goes on even today. Let's look at the slide about the Rohingyas. In Myanmar today, what used to be known as Burma, we have a Muslim population in the midst of a nominally Buddhist country. Myanmar, Burma is still a new country, still full of its own political instability as new countries try to come to their feet, and as babies are awkward when they're taking their first steps, new countries have difficulties as well. There are perhaps too many people living in Myanmar for the ability of the land to take care of everyone. They have crises every year with monsoons. And then there's this Burmese or Buddhist nationalism. The Rohingya are Muslims. They are of Arab descent, or claim to be. So there's this tension between groups. The crisis is offering the cover for the evil, and there is evil on both sides here. The Rohingya ARSA militants struck out against the Buddhist government. The Buddhist government reacts against that. Of course, the government has more resources, more power than the Rohingya have. So they're trying to flee into Bangladesh and India. It's a crisis that continues to go on today. Let's look at the next slide to talk about what's happening in Sudan, South Sudan, one of the newest countries in the world, where the people are having to adjust from having been farmers, cattle keepers. Now they've found rich deposits of petroleum there. That's changing everything. There's been civil war for a long time between the North and the South. We have this emerging nation state in South Sudan, and it is riven with tribal descent. So the Dinka, who are presently in charge, committing suicide against the Nuer. If the Nuer were in charge, they might be doing the same thing against the Dinka. These tribal hatreds are deep and go back a long, long way. Oh, human beings do not always act humanely. The Yazidis and the Christians in what the part of Iraq that used to be controlled by ISIL. The Yazidis are a monotheistic, endogamic, that means they only marry among themselves, a religious group in northern Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Centuries of religious disagreements lie behind the current charges that ISIL has launched genocidal attacks against the Yazidis. It's not just a matter of murder, not outright murder, it's enslavement for sex trafficking of Yazidi women. And ISIL has similarly targeted Christians in northern Iraq, recognized in a number of sources as cases of genocide. Genocide appears to be ubiquitous. We showed you the 9 cases that we wanted to discuss in our course. I checked this morning, I Googled current genocides. 50 genocides came up on the list in the 20th century, 20th and 21st centuries. We don't have to go beyond, we could go back further, but that was surprising to me, that so much of it was going on. One more slide, and then I think I turn things over. No, I've got a couple of more slides before I turn things back over to Joy. We look at the next slide. The genocide, here's good news that genocide is not inevitable, that there are things that can be done and have been done. Now, our students uncovered dozens of organizations that take it upon themselves to be constantly vigilant, looking for outbreaks of genocidal policies and behaviors. These agencies are international, ethnic, religious, economic, political in their constituencies. A place where it worked, where prevention and intervention worked, is in Bosnia. Now, the Bosnian genocide came about as a crisis that arose with the fall of communism around the world. The country of Bosnia said, we want to be independent again. And so they declared their independence from Yugoslavia back in 1992. Yugoslavia has been controlled by the Serbs. The greatest victors of World War I were the Serbs. They got everything they wanted, including being in charge of all those southern Slavic countries. They didn't want to lose Bosnia. That meant that they would lose access to the coastline of the Adriatic Sea. Furthermore, there are lots of Serbs living in Bosnia. We call them Bosnian Serbs. So they're fighting against Bosnia being able to have its independence. Then there are the people who live in Bosnia, many of them Muslims. We know them as the Bosniaks. And the Serbs, the Bosnian Serbs then start engaging in the ethnic cleansing of the Bosniaks, driving them out of existence, perhaps. Now, there are disputes about what was and what was not genocide in Bosnia. But there's no doubt that what happened at Srebrenica was a massacre, a genocidal massacre, where 7,000 men and boys were killed at one site. As the world found out about this, world rose up and NATO decided to intervene. And NATO started bombing the Bosnian Serb forces, driving them back and then driving them to agree to sit down at the diplomatic table and work things out. And the result was that the leaders of Serbia and Bosnia met in, of all places, Dayton, Ohio. What came about with the Dayton Accords, which brought about some semblance of peace and an end to the open genocide. Let's go on to the next.
Is it me?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, I want to give us a lesson too, hopefully in courage and hope, because crisis can breed courage and altruism in individuals as well. So in every genocide, Ted and I try to highlight the helpers, the people who were not passive bystanders, the ones who are upstanders, as Samantha Power, the former ambassador to the UN, called them. And I want to highlight here one of them from our own Tennessee, Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett opposed the Indian Removal Act of 1830 by President Andrew Jackson, and he lost his seat in Congress as a result of that, and he was unable to stop the genocide committed by our own nation against the Native Americans, the Trail of Tears, but he nevertheless demonstrated moral courage. I also want to point out that journalists were often many of the upstanders or helpers. Journalists like Dith Pran, they were, and Roy Gutman in Bosnia. They were among the last to leave these war-torn countries and among the first people to document the atrocities happening to them. There were also people like in power, people like Paul Rusesabagina and Oskar Schindler in Germany, who used their positions of power to help people during genocides. There were also many, many, many examples of ordinary citizens, people like Nicholas Winton, who was just a stockbroker when he saved over 600 Jewish children. He just noticed that there was a need and took it upon himself to help, because all of these individuals have certain characteristics in common. These qualities are a sense of responsibility to act, a sense that they can maybe have some effect in helping, an openness, and most importantly, they all have an inclusive group identity, meaning that they care about all human life, not just the people in their own family or their own nation or their own tribe, if you will. So I think in today's crisis, I can see heroes in people like the healthcare workers, the frontline workers. This is the doctor in China who sounded the alarm about COVID-19. And his actions probably brought the world a little bit more time that we needed, because he was going against his government to report that. Here we also see healthcare workers who love their country, but they care enough about it to criticize it. We had lessons about constructive versus blind patriotism. Genocide and government failings will grow under what we call blind patriotism. Constructive patriotism is when citizens love their country enough to point out weaknesses, flaws, or immorality. Whether it's journalists, government watchdog groups, or concerned citizens, we're stronger when we can admit that we could do better as a country. I think in the genocide course too, we spent a lot of time talking about how do we cultivate a culture of compassion as a means of preventing genocide. This includes modeling helping, critical thinking skills, promoting the welfare of all humanity. In such a culture, it's much harder to foster the kinds of prejudice that leads to genocide or the blind patriotism that leads to a rise of nationalism or support for authoritarian leaders. In the present day crisis, we've had the opportunity to cultivate this kind of culture. Things are going to get very heated as the virus pops up over the next year until a vaccine is found. So how do we keep cultivating the kind of compassion and enduring patience that's going to allow us to go in and out of quarantine as we need to? How do we maintain the kind of altruism that's easier when you have plenty of food, but is difficult when you're scared and in want? We talked about altruism too. Helping requires that you notice a need and that you feel responsible to act on that need. And I think, like many generations before us, we're facing a threat that requires national unity and collaboration. In many ways, we have risen to the challenge thus far. We've seen people donating to food banks and sewing masks for one another, picking up the phone and checking on one another. We've slowed down collectively as a nation to notice the effects of inequality and things like access to broadband internet, paid sick leave, healthcare. We've rallied to support small businesses who are struggling. We come to appreciate the work that healthcare workers do more than ever before. But how do we maintain that level of altruism as this crisis drags on for months and months? I think it's going to be hard. It's human nature to grow tired, to become desensitized to the pain and the suffering when it's on this kind of scale. The patience with social distancing is already growing pretty thin. So how do we strike that balance there? And how do we not turn inward as a nation, as a people? It's when we have a crisis like a tsunami that's localized or a hurricane that's localized to one country, we can kind of mobilize and go in and help for a short time. But how do you maintain altruism outside of your own country when it's on this kind of scale? I think it's difficult, especially as we're starting to barely manage our own economic and health issues. So we've slashed the World Health Organization at this time, which means that people in the poorest countries are already going to suffer even more. So, I ask a few questions here at the end. Are we going to rise to this, through this crisis? Are we going to rise to be better people, to fill the gaps that we have identified in the safety nets? Are we going to notice genocidal acts around the world? Or are we going to turn inward as a nation or as a people or as a group? I'm going to end there and turn it over to Ted and see if he has any final words.
I want to add two of the most disturbing things that I discovered while teaching this course. One is a statement that came from the book, The Problem from Hell, which is a really good treatment of genocide and what the United States State Department has done and not done. One statement of that book that a State Department spokesman uttered in the midst of the Rwandan crisis, the Rwandan genocide. The United States doesn't have friends. The United States only has interests. That's the way governments operate. Not on the basis of altruism, but interest. There are short-term interests and long-term interests, and the real statesmen see the long-term interests. The other disturbing statement comes from a book that was published in 1932 by Reinhold Niebuhr, Moral Man and Immoral Society. And he argues in that book that whereas individuals are capable of kindness and compassion and altruism and putting others before themselves, institutions are incapable of that. Whether the institution is a government or a university or a church or a multinational concern, those institutions are going to fight to stay alive. And mercy and kindness and compassion plays a little role there. Those are two disturbing things that I think I learned, and I'm checking against the rest of my experiences to see if those two statements are unfortunately true.
All right, we're ready for questions, I think.
Easy questions, yes.
All right. Joy, why don't you turn off the sharing screen so that we can see your beautiful faces more broadly? Thank you for that. If you do have questions, please use the chat feature and we will, I will address these questions. So our first question is this for both of you. The U.S. currently is using forced labor by a particularly I'm going to make sure I'm unmuted. Sorry, let me start again. The U.S. is currently using forced labor by a particularly endangered population to make our hand sanitizer and personal protective equipment prisoners. Can you speak to how we as a nation determined these lives to be less valued? And then this questioner also wonders how this might link to statements made by certain political figures that perhaps it's time for the elderly to sacrifice themselves so the rest of us can be free to get haircuts and go to restaurants. We start easy, work up from there.
Thanks for the softball there, people.
This is not the first time I've heard about a genocide against the elderly. And since I every day get closer and closer to that population group, I feel sensitive about it. Prisoners are an exploitable, nearly powerless minority. So this is an issue where the state has an interest. It needs a product. The state can manipulate things that way. It doesn't have to be moral if it's beneficial.
Anything you want to add to that, Joy?
It just makes me think of the fact that we privatize prisons, and so there's economic incentives among those privatized prisons to maybe use that population, and rather than try to rehabilitate, reduce recidivism, there's economic incentive to keep that population further incarcerated. So it's just sad all the way around.
Would this be a good case in your discussion of remedies for genocide, that one of the most important things that needs to be done is light needs to be shed on these kinds of issues, and we need people with the courage to stand up and speak about that?
Yes, absolutely.
I think one of the strongest things we have going for us in the United States still is a free press, that with reporters that will go in and ask questions and probe and try to find out what's really going on.
All right, our next question is this. I remember from Dr. Drinnon's general psychology course, the power of face-to-face contact in changing people's point of view. What then is the effect of the increasing polarization caused by internet communication platforms, such as social media, and the current total lack of face-to-face contact?
Yeah, so one group dynamic is that we do become more polarized, especially if we limit our contacts to people who share our point of view. If we just limit what people we talk to or who we stay friends with in social media to only those people who agree with us or share our point of view, we're not going to hear lots of other ideas, and maybe not hear about things like prisoners being exploited if those people aren't in our queue. So I think we just have to be more intentional about keeping those connections when we are online and not isolating ourselves to just people that agree with us. I'm not sure if that quite got at the whole question or not, but.
All right, let's move on. Do you think the world's current capacity for connectivity through technology will have either a positive or negative effect on how the world will react?
I, of course, hope that it will have a positive effect. But all this connection also makes the possibility of the spread of rumors and misinformation. All that is more possible now than it's ever been before. So it's a tool like the printing press for incalculable good and incalculable evil.
Mm-hmm.
Human nature is still in charge of how these gifts are used.
Yeah, I worry most that because this crisis is so huge, so global, and so long lasting, that we're just going to grow so weary of it that we're going to turn it off, because it's unmanageable sometimes. It's too difficult, and so I think people will turn to easier non-controversial topics to talk about when they get together with people. Avoid hearing more information that's going to make them already more fearful than they already are. So I think a lot of things are going to fall to the wayside that we might have noticed or paid attention to, but because there's so much out there that we'll miss some of these signs of additional conflict or genocide that are important, or prison populations, for example.
All right, we have another question. Would you consider that the wipeout of Down syndrome infants from being allowed to be born in some countries and even shows up in the US as a related kind of issue?
The unborn are a weak, exploitable minority. They are inconvenient. Handicapped children are a burden, maybe a beloved burden that their parents have to bear. But if our measure of worth is only in dollars and cents, which was the case in the Third Reich, they labeled all those people who could not earn money and could not work in factories and wouldn't pay taxes. They were all labeled as life unworthy of life. That may be the way we're regarding prison populations too. They cost us money. Let's put them to work. Let's make them productive.
Yeah.
So yes, the genocide of Down syndrome unborn babies, that is a genocide.
Mm-hmm.
Do either of you have any concrete, very practical ways that we can build a sense of common humanity within ourselves and our communities, the kind of sense of common humanity that keeps us from treating other populations as subhuman, which itself feeds this very kind of genocidal behavior? What kind of practical things can we do as a community, whether in our cultural community or within our church and school communities?
Social exchanges, educational exchanges, sending students overseas to engage other cultures, to find out, to dispel the myths of Africa and the myths of Asia, and to turn those myths into personal relationships with real live people. Real shoulder rubbing and experience sharing with people all over the world. And that's kind of an expensive solution, expensive on a personal basis. But governments can encourage this. So right after World War II, the United States, or elements in the United States, formed the American Field Service with the intent of bringing German high school students to America for a year to go to high school in America and learn what a student council is and learn what democracy is like. And then they were sent back to Germany and a new wave was brought. Mm-hmm. So this intentional turning the enemy into the friend through getting to know each other better.
Yeah, supporting pluralism in a country, supporting the idea of differences and diversity and welcoming that, seeing that as valuable. Ted mentioned things that involve contact. We may have limited contact, but right now I think as people are staying at home, a simple kind of thing to do would be to look at other types of media, books and films that have different points of view for populations that maybe you wouldn't come into contact with or can't right now because of social distancing. So being intentional about caring enough to learn about other populations, about other cultures, about other languages besides your own. And I think those are cheap and simple things to do, simply immersing yourself in additional types of media.
All right, we have one final question before we have to go, and that is this. We may have two, but let me give you this one. What do you think will be the consequences, if any, of protesters during this current crisis who are not utilizing constructive patriotism?
They're going to get sick. That's one of the consequences. Some of them are going to get sick. That was flippant. I apologize for my flippancy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say they probably do view this as patriotic. I think they do see it as resisting what they see as overreach by the government to ask people to stay home. This is one of those social dilemmas we talk about in social psychology, when the rights of a few people, if you have too many people wanting access to water or wanting access to restaurants, you're going to inevitably cause damage to the entire group. It's a social dilemma. You can't, we have to find ways to cooperate so that we don't have those big scale social dilemmas, zero-sum games, if you will. Kind of rambling a bit here, but it seems that we just have to cooperate more and recognize when something is oppression versus when something is an inconvenience. I think listening to scientists is important too right now. They don't necessarily have all the information. They can't predict the future, of course, but we have examples from history, like the pandemic of 1918, that we can look to see what are the differences between communities that stayed in and practiced social distancing versus communities that kind of went out before it was all under control, and waiting for the testing, I think, is helpful. But
all right, let me make this our final question, and then I'm sure others will want to continue to talk in other platforms. But this is our final question. Do you find it surprising that Chinese individuals have been scapegoated given the importance of China as a world power?
It's disappointing, but I'm not surprised. I think the other targets right now for us, fear needs a foe. Those are Joy's words from earlier on. So Iran is a very convenient foe to have, and we can focus fear and hatred toward that country to take our minds off of what's going on right here. China, Iran, those are, I wouldn't exactly call China a powerless minority that we could easily pick on, but fear and in that direction, it's unfortunate, but it's understandable. It's not forgivable, but it's understandable.
Do either of you have a final thought you want to put in before we thank our audience and thank our two speakers?
Thanks for showing up, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for your interest in this.
Okay, so once again, in your way that you can wave or clap to yourself or whatever, let's thank Joy Drinnon and Ted Thomas for their participation. Here we go.
If you're going to clap, please turn your audio on.
our group clapper, so we'll all give a little applause. We're very thankful for your fine presentation and thoughtfulness of it. And we're grateful for everybody who's joined us tonight and for perhaps others who will be able to view this at a future time. Thank you so much. Thank you for ending this day of research sharing on such a fine note. Thank you both. And
Thank
thanks
you,
to all
John.
who've come.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Everybody stay safe out there.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks, Ted.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Good job, Joy.
Thanks,
Proud-
Mom.
Oh, hi.
Yes, Mom, this is Ted.
We've met before, back in 2002 or something, when we took some students over to Maryville. We dropped your kids off at their grandparents' house.
Oh, have no memory of that.
There's a lot of those days I don't remember. But I appreciate your comment. That was my question about the Down syndrome, because that greatly concerns me. I love a program called This Is My Life by Roy Feek about his little Down syndrome daughter. And I really think social media has helped a lot of people to love these children,
Mhm.
see their work.
And they are, many of them, unusually lovable.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, they're all, so I told Joy, and I have 8 pages of notes from Joyce.
I could have sent you the PowerPoint, Mom.
I know it, but they're my notes.
All right, we're being recorded, so I think we probably need to finish up.
That's true. That's true.
Okay,
Good
see you
night.
later.
Kelly can edit that out.
Yeah.
I figured they'll edit, so. Thank
Thank
you
you,
all.
John, for hosting. Thank you, Mary.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
You can leave your mom in there. I like it. See you all.
See ya.
There it goes.